Afternoon, everybody. We're just waiting for a few more minutes until a few more people join. But welcome. We're quite excited to have you all. Can I ask that everybody who's not speaking, if you could just put yourself on mute. And also it's going to be quite an interactive session. So ideally we would like for you to post your questions in the comment section. And we're not going to allow you to, we're not going to switch on your videos and allow you to ask the questions, but I will happily read them out. And if there's a specific person for your specific question that you would like for us, that you'd like to answer the question. But yes, as we await a few more people to come through, I would like to welcome you all, friends and fellow colleagues, to today's launch of the South African Startup Act draft position paper. My name is Matsi Modise. I'm the Vice Chairperson of SiMODiSA, an industry association for entrepreneurs by entrepreneurs. If you don't know us by now, then today you'll definitely get to know us because we're all about collaborating the ecosystem. And I'm also the chairperson of the South African Startup Act Steering Committee. We'll tell you a little bit more about that. And a little bit about myself. I am an entrepreneur, founder of Furaha Africa Holdings. I'm an entrepreneurship activist, very passionate about entrepreneurship in our country, very passionate about how do we create an enabling environment, but how do we also connect the dots? How do we connect each other as an ecosystem? And most importantly, I am a South African citizen. I'd like to grow my business locally and internationally, so that we can create jobs, empower our communities, and also be globally competitive. We're here today to launch the draft position paper of the proposed Startup Act. And it's here to set out the what, the why, the how, as a nation can go about creating an enabling environment for our high impact, high growth innovation startups to thrive. And the reason why it's a draft position paper is because such a position paper is not finalized until the ecosystem has finalized it. But this is our first stab at bringing something out that has been well thought out, that has been well researched, and it's going to enable us to be able to mobilize going forward. The outcomes of today's session is to give you an update of where we are on this journey of creating a Startup Act for South Africa. Because the last time we had a community-based conversation about it was last year around June, July. And we had a lot of inputs around, should South Africa have a Startup Act? Why a Startup Act? We already have existing legislation. So there were a lot of mixed thoughts, but all in all, we do agree that something must be done because currently, as high impact, high growth startups in South Africa, we still don't have that traction. We're still not collaborating and speaking with one voice. And in essence, here's our opportunity to, in essence, go forward and try, right? All we can do is try. But I think for everybody involved and also the broader ecosystem, South Africa cannot afford to try. We have to now do. So outcomes of today is also to highlight the draft position paper, what it's covered so far, having a conversation with key players in the ecosystem, one of them being a high impact, high growth South African entrepreneur that's been able to be a co-founder of a global business. Hear some of his challenges, and then also map out the next steps and engagements, because this is a bit of a process and it's important that we educate each other around what does it entail, because it's not something that's going to happen within a short period of time. And also today's conversation will cover Stephan Lamprecht will discuss the high-level findings of the draft position paper. He'll also discuss the key ecosystem players. They'll be able to tell us their thoughts and inputs. And then also we'll get to engage with you. We'll get to inform you as to our thinking, but then also get a sense of, we want you to be part of the movement. We want you to be part of the solution. And lastly, what we expect from you as the ecosystem that's joined us today is, we don't have it all figured out. Like I said, I'm passionate about entrepreneurship. I am an entrepreneur myself, and the people that are on this particular panel are also very much, they have their own interests in the sense of they want to see South Africa work. So we don't have it all figured out. And we also want you to be part of the solution, not the problem. We want you to come up with an open mind. We want you to give us constructive and not destructive feedback. And also, we don't want you to just talk. If you're going to propose something, if you're going to mention something, come up with a solution, because if you reckon one thing is not going to work, then tell us what is going to work, because it's about constructive engagements. And then also, we want you to be part of the coalition. We want you to be part of the movement, because this is an ecosystem play. I think it's time that now the ecosystem stops performing in silos, but we actually act as a collective. And without going into too much detail, and after me, Stephan Lamprecht will be unpacking the findings of the draft position paper. It's important to know that it's going to cover what a startup is in the South African context, because startups, people have different definitions for it. So I think we'll highlight what we mean by a startup. It's underpinned by innovation, it's fast growing, it's dynamic, have a great potential to create jobs. We'll also do talk about why do startups matter in the South African context. We do know that there are high levels of unemployment in our country. We're creating businesses, but we're not able to cater to what the economy needs in terms of our ability to create jobs. And then also, what is a Startup Act? Because a lot of people are not familiar with the concept. It is something that's been done globally. It's been done over the past couple of years, and on the continent, it's gaining a lot of momentum. So what is the Startup Act? In essence, we'll kind of unpack what that means. And then currently existing laws, because a lot of people are asking the question, why reinvent the wheel? Well, guess what? We still have, our economy is not performing highly. We are not very competitive as South African startups. Some of the legislations that we have are making us very uncompetitive globally, even locally. So there is a need for us to look at what currently exists and how can we either create something that would work in parallel with what exists or something that's brand new. So those are some of the considerations that we'll be having. So I'm not going to go into way too much details. I just want to welcome you all. We're very excited. A little bit of anxiety because we know that the Startup Act has been quite a contentious thing for others, quite an exciting thing for some of us. But today it's about how do we now talk about what is a Startup Act? Does South Africa need it? What are your inputs and what are the next steps? And without further ado, I'm going to allow Stephan Lamprecht, who is the founder of VC Nova, and he's been the lead researcher of the position paper. A man that has done a lot of research around the ecosystem. He's done a lot of research for SiMODiSA. I know he's done a lot of research for Silicon Cape and just the ecosystem at large. And he's going to then now unpack the findings of the draft position paper. And I'm going to labor on the word draft because it's not finalized. It's what we are putting out there as a foundational document. And in essence, over the next coming months, we're going to now build up on it as we engage the ecosystem further. So Stephan, I will hand it over to you to give us the findings of the draft position paper.
Thanks very much, Matsi. Just checking that you can hear me and you can see me. All right, can I carry on?
Yes, we can, Stephan.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity. Yeah, I think this is a very exciting event, and it's a very exciting milestone that we've achieved and that we've reached. And by and large, thank you also very much to all the supporters, not just the various people on the steering committee and the World Bank that has been a contributor to some of the research and also helped us to do this, but also very much in terms of the participants that's given us inputs, that's gone online, that's reviewed some of our earlier findings, as well as the people that have participated in the public discussion groups. Yeah, so as Matsi indicated, we started off with the question to say, from a South African point of view, is there value in having some kind of an act or having some kind of a legal instrument with which to really support and take further the opportunities that we see in the South African startup ecosystem? And we started off by just looking at, globally speaking, seeing what other countries have done. quite a number of Startup Act initiatives around Africa, Tunisia, Ghana, Kenya, Tanzania also recently, as well as Startup Acts in other continents that have gone before us. And one of the key things that we found from that is that, number one, when we talk about startups, the concept of creating new businesses and especially high growth businesses is not necessarily a new initiative or a new concept, but that legislation around the world is not always kept up in terms of terminology and especially in terms of alignment between the different acts that impact on the various startup ecosystems. So from that point of view, one of the first things to start off with was to realize that as a South African, we need to consider what is important to us and where are the priorities that might be different in South Africa compared to other countries. Through the public conversations that we've had with you and the contributions from people, I think one of the most pertinent things that stood out in all of the conversations was the reality that a lot of our startups, when they go through a high growth phase and they get to the opportunity to scale globally or start attracting investment with which to go to their next growth phase, many of them are faced with the realization that they have to go offshore. They have to either repatriate, they've got to move IP offshore, which is difficult and costly to do, but also some of them have physically got to base themselves because of the realities of attracting investment into South Africa. And I think what stood out for us in these conversations is the reality that how does it work that we as South African startups, rooted in our own networks, rooted in our own understanding of our local markets, when we need to grow and really bring the value that we would like to see, the value that sits with a national development plan that talks about the ambitions of growth and inclusive growth, transformation, competitiveness, when we really have instruments that are able to develop and render those opportunities, then these are forced to go and leave South Africa for the benefit of growth. And that doesn't make sense. At the end, we sit in the reality that a lot of that value doesn't come back to South Africa. So from that point of view, and I think that sits at the heart of the Startup Act, is that this act and the proposed act is rooted in the National Development Plan and sits there as an instrument to utilize the value that comes from small enterprises. It echoes National Treasury's policy on economic transformation, inclusive growth and competitiveness, and the references related to high growth enterprises, and that those enterprises are the ones that you cannot foretell from the beginning whether or not the small enterprise will have a high growth spurt, but you can increase the potential of doing so. Because once they go through that high growth spurt, it is actually a minority of a number of these small enterprises that actually render the development opportunities and the job creation and the economic social impact that we are after. So from that point of view, and taking into account also various declarations in terms of small enterprises and the need for them to have access to finance and market access, as well as the Presidential Commission on the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and the finding that small enterprises have to be positioned for the commercialization of homegrown innovations towards building these global scale and the relevance that would actually then deliver on the opportunities and the impact that we would like to see from these small enterprises. So from that point of view, I think the key message in this proposed act is that the act is not an attempt to build anything new. We are not calling for a new policy. We are not calling for the scrapping of laws or for the changing of laws, but this is really about trying to improve the environment in which our entrepreneurs operate by removing those regulations and by removing those barriers that are sometimes hampering the growth that we need to see from our startups in order to have them really contribute to the socioeconomic impact that we really need and desire in our country. So the Startup Act has at the bottom, at its heart, a mechanism that talks about a set of relaxations and incentives within the context of the policy and legal environment that impacts on startup enterprises in South Africa. It does not intend to replace or propose the change policies and legal environment that is there. We've got quite a developed legal environment in South Africa, but rather is it the question to say, and we would like to bring this to the attention at the highest level. And we say, President Ramaphosa, you have made a huge impact on the energy sector by lifting the regulations and the limits in terms of allowing private sector participation in this important sector. We are asking for the same from now on, to ask that startups be exempted from all the hoops that they have to jump through in terms of really growing and accelerating the growth in our country. So from that point of view, and at the heart of the Startup Act, is a call to the President of South Africa to unleash the growth and innovation embedded in our entrepreneurs and our youth by exempting qualifying new enterprises with a turnover of less than 100 million rand from the limitations of existing policies and red tape that constrain their growth and ability to contribute to job creation. So what we want to do is to say, we don't need new regulations, we don't need new instruments, but rather by an enterprise complying with a certain set of criteria with which we believe that criteria points towards the opportunity for high growth, that these innovation and startups that are technology, oftentimes technology, but not exclusively technology driven. I mean, in this week, there was the announcements related to Ogalito, the chicken franchise that started in Bombela, with one enterprise that have grown to 160 enterprises. That has been one of the job creation successes in our country. These are the type of startups that we believe needs to be accelerated and the benefit brought to the rest of the economy. So the proposed interventions are premised on the findings that immediate benefits can accrue to job creation, economic transformation, and the competitiveness of the whole economy, because startups that grow impact on the overall supply chain of goods and products in our country. These are all the mainstays of the National Development Plan, very much believing that startup enterprises will bring the National Development Plan into reality. Accordingly, it outlines a number of relaxations to current legislation and policies impact on the growth and investment into startups, including, for example, impact on exchange controls, the formulation of capital gains tax, and it advocates for the introduction of incentives to stimulate capital contribution from early stage funding entities. I mean, a lot of enterprises can really accelerate the growth and the impact that they have by getting the right type of early stage investment and getting the right partners that are able to take them globally. Our other relaxations include simplifying procurement policies so that startups can really compete with larger enterprises in the national economy. Direct funding of the growth of startup businesses through automatic reinvestment of pay and VAT, and easing of labor immigration laws to foster the availability and access to talent. So the Startup Act is about simplifying what we have. It's not about bringing in new laws or new regulations or new funding instruments, but it's about relaxing what we've got already so that startup enterprises can flourish. I think that's all from my side. I welcome the opportunity that we have to present these findings. And I think in the context of where we want to go as a nation, this is the time to really take startups enterprises seriously. Our startup entrepreneurs are at the heart of most of the innovation that are disrupting a lot of sectors in South Africa. But by really investing in them and giving them the opportunity and the freedom to grow, we will have the opportunity to really impact into the lives of everyone in South Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephan, and I think most importantly for all the work that you've been doing. You really ensured that we in the process of coming up with the position paper, there was a lot of consultation with a diversity within the ecosystem. I think, we went to the guys at, the ICASI labs, or township technology entrepreneurs. We went to the Africa Arena community, which is, quite a broad technology ecosystem, not just in South Africa, but, on the continent as well. So for Stephan to put together this position paper, it was not necessarily desktop research. There was a component of that, but there was also a lot of community engagements. And yeah, I think a lot of people are wondering, especially if you're an entrepreneur, does this relate to me as a startup? Am I a startup? And some of the underpinning components of what we mean by a startup is it must be a fast-growing, dynamic enterprise. It has to be underpinned by innovation. It has to have the potential to create jobs. And these are sometimes newly formed businesses or early stage businesses that are in their growth phase. And some examples of what we would see as a startup that defines the kind of companies we're dealing with is the likes of the Yokos, the Go Ones, the Sweep South, the Go Smarters, the Spark Schools. So there's a lot of those, but have we been able to define them in the South African context? And also, why does it matter? Why do startups matter in the South African economy? Do they have the ability to create those jobs that we are all seeking for? And do they foster innovation? Do they, one of the things that startups do is increase the taxable revenue base, create jobs, and also become globally competitive, because it's nice to see our flag shining, not just in rugby, but to say that, you know, South Africa is a startup nation. But how do we create a foundation? How do we create an environment that enables those startups to thrive? And in essence, I think Stephan also just spoke about how it's something that is a proposed economic bill. We're not trying to replace anything that already exists, because a lot of work has been done. So for those of, you know, our audiences that are coming from the government, it's very clear that we want to work together. We want to be able to engage with the government. We want to have a bottom-up approach versus a top-bottom approach, because as an ecosystem, we would like to be defined. We would like to be able to have an identity, and also we would like to guide the government around what it is that we require. So without further ado, I'm going to now introduce our panelists that we will have a conversation about the Startup Act. So first on our panel is Melvyn Lubega. He's a South African co-founder of Go1, which is a high-impact, high-growth global startup. We also have Adrian Dommisse from Dommisse Attorneys. His contributions and focus on the panel will be around the legalities, the legal aspects, because he's worked with a lot of startups that have been able to scale globally. So what has been his experience? We'll also have a conversation with Tanya van Lill from SAVCA, you know, so from a funding perspective, venture capital perspective, she'll be able to give us some inputs. And then also we have Dr. Sumarie Roodt. I'm sure she's not happy with the fact that I'm calling her doctor, but she is a doctor, Sumarie Roodt, and her focus, she's one of the members at Silicon Cape, and her focus will be on the current tech innovation ecosystem perspective, because they do represent that from a Cape perspective. And we also have you, who are our entrepreneurs, who you know, who are our ecosystem players, either supporting entrepreneurs or you building your own business. And we'd also want you to be part of the conversation. So my first question is going to go towards Melvyn, who he's an entrepreneur. So he's a reason why we're here. He's a reason why we need to consider having a Startup Act. And in essence, he's going to give us his perspectives around what his experience has been growing a global business. You know, there are not a lot of people that can say that they've been able to scale globally. There are not a lot of people that could say that they have a business that is defined as a unicorn. And in essence, how did he do it? But then from a South African perspective, how have we enabled or how have we disabled his ability to grow this business? So Melvyn, welcome. My question to you would be, in your journey on building Go1 as a global business, what is working and what is not working in the startup ecosystem right now in South Africa?
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Matsi. I think this is an important conversation. I think probably an important perspective, although mine is more anecdotal from my experience. I think there are many startup founders that, you know, have a myriad of challenges, and ones which I may not face, or ones which I face and they don't face. But I think at the, you know, outset, just to give everyone context, so Melvyn Lubega, young South African, born in Johannesburg. And what we do at Go1 is we exist to help organizations help people unlock their positive potential through a love for learning. So very focused on the human capital development side of things. And so how we do it is through a platform, which is almost like a Netflix for corporate training. So what we do is we aggregate learning resources and courses from the best providers globally, and offer that to organizations in over 20 countries on a subscription basis. And it's been interesting in building out the business. I think, Matsi, to your question around the ways in which the ecosystem has hindered and enabled us, I think what one often forgets, and I think it's more the entrepreneur's perspective, is that, you know, it is hard being an entrepreneur and you're always almost fighting to survive. And I think the benefits of succeeding, I think this is what I quite like about the draft paper so far, is that it speaks to the fact that there's a collective gain, because ultimately we are one team. And I think, you know, it's one of our company values, but I think if we see ourselves as a country as being on one team, because the reality is in the global world, we are competing globally with other countries, other companies. with other ecosystems. And I think if we get onto the same page and enable that growth together, we will have outsized impacts. And I think it's something which I reflect on fairly frequently, where, fairly early on in our journey, and I think, for example, when we're raising one of our rounds, I remember the Australian government, one of the entities, offered to come into our round and effectively offered our investors in the round at the time, saying like, look, we'll invest in this round, and because you're co-investing in a company that has a presence in Australia, what we will do is, at some point, I think it was in 2 years' time, they exited as the actual government, and they actually gave those early investors preferable rates, almost at the same valuation. So there was significant unlock for those investors. Again, just doing what one can to unlock that ecosystem. But the challenge is we're competing both for capital, competing for talent, competing for access to market. And so if I think about our journey at Go1, a big thing for us was access to market. And that's why on day one, we began to look internationally, because we realized that the environment in South Africa at the outset wasn't necessarily conducive for the scale we wanted to achieve. And I think it's not that companies want to move away from South Africa. They probably move away from South Africa from an interest of survival. For example, if you can't attract capital, how can you compete with your colleagues elsewhere around the world? I was in Europe last week for a meeting, and you're hearing startups in Germany where there's just an enabling ecosystem supported by the government in various ways, of course. And I think that's something which I think on our journey would have enabled us to accelerate our growth and also do even more in South Africa, because we have a global team at this point in time. And I think things like access to talent are important and so forth. And so whilst one may not realize what the counterfactual is, so you won't know whether you would have succeeded if you were in a different country or if you had access to that market, to that investment, but it's going to be hard already. How can we as an ecosystem make it easier for our own? And I think that's where I like the analogies of, the US Silicon Valley ecosystem and the role that the government played in enabling that. And I think it's not that one can learn, and has really gone into examining this position paper to unlock that. And I think for us, on the Go1 perspective, I think in hindsight, and I mean, we began, it wasn't as sexy as it was to be an entrepreneur. I think back then, if you're an entrepreneur, someone said, why don't you just get a job in corporate, don't struggle. And I think what we're seeing now with society, and I think the community, is enabling entrepreneurs to take that risk. But I think a lot more can be done in terms of the enabling ecosystem which that takes place as well.
Great, Melvyn. Thank you so much for this insights. I did see on the chat room somebody wanting you to unpack a little bit more about Go1, and then someone is generous enough to kind of share your the link to your website, which will basically give you all the information. But one of the things is we're very proud of you kind of flying the South African flag, and we definitely need more of you. I think, Mal, you're probably 33 years old. I think the other day you turned 33. So you're very young, you're very dynamic, and you're flying the South African flag. And we definitely need more Go1s that are going to represent South Africa and are also competitive. So well done on the achievement so far, but we definitely need to be able to create an environment that has more and more of yourselves. And also, as you post your questions and comments in the chat room, please do not promote your products. Those comments will be deleted. We're here to have constructive inputs and conversations. So I would just advise that we don't necessarily push our products, selling clothes and apparel and everything else. Adrian, my next question is for you. Somebody who is in the legal practice. Do you think that South Africa needs a Startup Act? And if so, what legislative constraints should it tackle? That's my first question to you, Adrian.
Thanks,
Could
Matsi.
you also introduce yourself and what your organization does before you answer the question?
Yes, with pleasure. Thank you, Matsi. I really appreciate being part of this panel. So Dommisse Attorneys has been going for 12 years, and we focus exclusively on supporting tech startups in their journey of setup, fund, grow, and sell. We're a team of about 10, and that's all we do. We don't work in any other areas of law, litigation, or property, that sort of thing. We've worked for clients like Yappy Chef, Get Smarter, Jeff Fitness, Online Fitness Faculty, SnapScan, those sort of clients. So we get a really good sense of what they are up against in their context. And their context is important. We should align very clearly on what these startups are trying to do, and that's create radical global value. And they do that by funding themselves locally and internationally, but significantly internationally, accessing global markets, and creating an appeal to an international acquirer. Now, in that context, our firm should really just be doing two exciting things. Private equity, so negotiating funding on behalf of our clients, and exits, negotiating the sale of our clients. And if we were in Silicon Valley, I'm pretty sure that's all our firm would do. However, our firm spends half its time doing international structures. And what we then have to do is we have to use rules which are actually intended for massive corporates, think big mining houses. And we have to use those rules and we have to apply them to a small startup without a lot of capital or people. And we've got to create their international structure so they can set up companies offshore to raise funding and ultimately present themselves. And that is really fundamentally the challenge that we face from our perspective. If we can streamline those processes and build them in ways in which are accessible and easy to roll out, we would have achieved radical things as a group, as a community. The exchange controls have liberalized significantly in the last year, but it hasn't really achieved the goal, actually. The current, you might have heard the loop exemption, you now can have an offshore holding company, but it's got to buy your South African company for cash, which creates an interim tax hurdle, which is, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to overcome. There are various other technical issues I'd love to talk through. I don't want to bore everyone to death, though, but fundamentally, we're all looking, all our clients and many people on this call are looking at creating international waves. And South Africans do that. We're excellent at doing that. But in order to do that, we've got to be able to access international markets of funding and customers. And then translate that back into South Africa. And if we can streamline the current exchange controls and tax and make sure that we're all aligned on exits, so deferring tax events until exits and really creating wealth, the startup industry in this country is going to absolutely rock. It can go really well.
Great. Thank you so much, Adrian, for that. I do see that Daniel Shaw has had to drop off, but there's a couple of questions that he has, which we should, I think they'll be relevant to everybody. And at a later stage, when you're doing our question and answers, I will refer to those. So my next question is to Tanya, who is responsible at SAVCA, the South African Venture Capital and Private Equity Association. And we all know that the big F word in our industry is funding, and it's such a challenge. And in essence, one of the questions that I have around, and Tanya, knowing that you've done a lot of lobbying and advocacy with the government around funding and just unpacking funding and ensuring that it's accessible, do you think that having a Startup Act will make your job easier? And how do you think it will make it easier?
Thanks, Matsi. It's great to be here. Welcome, everyone. And it's great that there's this effort to collaborate, because for far too long, the startup ecosystem has been very fragmented. So wonderful to be here. In terms of fundraising, yes, so a big part or big role that SAVCA plays is the advocacy and promoting of private equity and venture capital in the region. Just as Melvyn said, how entrepreneurs always will compete for funding, so too do fund managers, whether they're private equity or venture capital. They compete for funding between themselves, between regions, and even with other asset classes. But the more funding we can attract to the venture capital fund managers, the more funding they will be able to invest in startups and early stage companies. We have a huge funding gap in South Africa, that we don't have enough VC fund managers with big enough fund sizes to be able to invest in the kinds and the volume of entrepreneurs that we see are coming to the market. And they're also not able to fuel or fund the growth that we're seeing. So an example like Go1, as Melvyn said, they're on this massive growth trajectory, but they need to go offshore to go and raise funds. And a Startup Act and what's being proposed will really, it will make my life easier, but it's more about what it would do for the ecosystem. Will we see more money flowing to VC fund managers or early stage investors? Ultimately, will we see more money flowing to the startups? And are we giving the startups and the scale-ups a fighting chance? As Melvyn said, it's tough enough to be an entrepreneur. Let's make it easier for these entrepreneurs to be able to scale, give them a fighting chance, and ultimately it will be beneficial for the country in terms of our competitiveness, and as Stephan said, in terms of job creation and just adding to the bottom line of the country in terms of GDP. and to the tax fiscus eventually. So based on the work that we do and the advocacy that we do, this Startup Act speaks directly to it, and a lot of work that we've done over the years. And it's great that everything that we've been talking about and advocating about is now captured in one position paper, and that there's additional consultation taking place so that we get all the voices in the ecosystem together to help mold and shape this. So ultimately it's a win-win, whether you are an investor, an entrepreneur, a policymaker, an ecosystem builder. It really is something that would be beneficial to the country, and just our goal to create more entrepreneurs and more jobs.
Great. Tanya, I think I like what you said, because the things that we are talking about and reflecting on are not new, but I think you also made reference to, we have quite a segregated ecosystem. And for once, it's an opportunity for us to collaborate, work together, speak as one voice, and then be able to tackle some of the pertinent issues. In essence, that's what the Startup Act aims to achieve, is how do we collaborate as an ecosystem? How do we come together, and how are we able to then articulate the challenges that we're having? And then provide guidelines to the government and all interested organizations and parties as to how do we create this enabling environment for a company like a Go1 to be able to thrive in a South African context, to be able to want to originate itself here, grow itself here, versus having to now go somewhere else where, you know, regulations are much more friendlier, are much more easier to navigate, and versus, you know, being in an environment which is quite, it doesn't really enable. There's some, you know, I mean, I'm not saying this because we're being negative, but there are clear examples of how a lot of our entrepreneurs are wanting to register their companies in Mauritius versus in South Africa, because we've got exchange control, we've got leap structures to deal with, and they're not easy to navigate. They're quite expensive and they take a long time. So I think South Africa is at a turning point, and in essence, the Startup Act is how do we collaborate as an ecosystem? How do we, and it's a timeless thing. It's not going to just happen all at once. Initially, we'll have the first batch of challenges that we want to overcome, and then build up on that. But something has to happen, and you know, across the continent, you know, countries like Tunisia, Senegal. You know, Nigeria is quite, you know, it's quite aggressive around coming up with a Startup Act. And it's not because we're following a fad or a trend, but we have honest intentions of how do we just articulate the needs of the startups in South Africa, especially innovation-driven startups in South Africa, because that's something that's still missing. And so my next question is going to go to Sumarie from Silicon Cape. And they represent a microcosm of innovation and technology community in South Africa. And my question to her is, how will the interventions introduced in the Startup Act help your community? Because, you know, you guys are quite a strong proponent in the Western Cape, representing technology entrepreneurs. And in responding, Sumarie, I'd like for you to introduce yourself, the role that you play in the ecosystem, and then just answer that particular question.
Great. Thanks, Matsi, and thanks for having us with you today. It's great to be here with everyone. So as Matsi said, I am the co-chairperson of what is known as the Silicon Cape Initiative. It is a not-for-profit that was established just over 10 years ago, which really was founded with this vision of turning Cape Town into the Silicon Cape of the Silicon Valley of Africa. I mean, literally, that was the vision of the founders. And, you know, here we are, and it's 2021, so it's a little more than just 10 years. But where we find ourselves now really is that Cape Town is consistently being ranked as one of the top tech innovation hubs in the world. Certainly from an emerging economy perspective, and also is seen as one of the tech digital hubs in Africa. So as Matsi said, I'm the co-chair for Silicon Cape, and then I'm also the founder of what is known as the Tech for Good Lab at the University of Cape Town. And that is Africa's first dedicated Tech for Good research lab, which really is all about using technology to make the world a better place. And the world for us means Africa. I'm deeply passionate about this continent. I'm deeply passionate about how technology can enable the transformation of the continent. And I think also that's why, you know, Matsi and I have a meeting of minds in terms of sharing certain passions. So just in terms of Matsi's question, which was really geared about, you know, how the Startup Act will potentially then influence the Silicon Cape ecosystem. So, I mean, at its very essence, for me, the first thought that comes to mind is that it would enable more startups to create a structure here in South Africa. Similar to what many panelists have already said, I have been in a number of sessions with startups this week where, without any exception, all of them have decided to domicile their companies outside of South Africa, so offshore and offshore even in terms of the continent. So many have decided to domicile in Delaware, for example. And you know, I find it heartbreaking when I hear that, but it's just a reality that our startups are faced with in terms of investors not wanting to place their money into an environment, you know, where there are restrictions on how they can move their money around. So, and I mean, that's really simplifying the complexity of the matter. But especially in the Silicon Cape ecosystem, what we have is we really deal with high-tech startups. So this means startups that in many cases use one or more forms of fourth industrial technologies, okay, fourth industrial revolution technologies. So anything from AI, machine learning, blockchain, 3D printing, drones. And we've seen a number of successful high growth startups come out of that tech space. So for examples being aerobotics and where they use drone technology in the agri sector. And I see that Adrian Dommisse, who spoke earlier on, actually represented them. So he's well versed in that, no doubt. So essentially, Matsi, to answer your question, it really for me will spur on a whole, hopefully, explosion of new startups, also particularly in terms of our youthful entrepreneurs. So as we all know, our youth unemployment figures are quite shocking. And entrepreneurship is seen as one of the possible enablers to, you know, to try and alleviate some of that. So, and also what we've seen is that technology entrepreneurship has specifically been identified at a national level as holding that potential too. So I think what it could mean for our ecosystem is that we see a whole influx of new young entrepreneurs coming into the space. We will see people being upskilled in digital skills at a rate that we haven't seen previously. The narrative really is around, you know, this digitization of Africa theme, and South Africa, you know, needs to play its part in that. And whilst we've been, you know, doing some good work, there's still so much work that needs to be done. And I really see that the proliferation of this Startup Act could be the very thing that you know, really helps us to contribute also to that digitization movement, both at a national level and then continentally. The other thing to mention is that I really do want to mention here, sorry, is the African Free Trade Agreement. So, you know, we potentially will become one of the biggest economic blocs in the world. And specifically from a tech perspective, there are massive opportunities that could be unlocked for our startups. That are high growth startups who could then expand into other regions in Africa relatively easily. If we also have the Startup Act in combination then with the African Free Trade Agreement, and you know, then I see a whole nother platform for our high growth tech startups being able to expand into other huge economic blocks across the globe. So yeah, Matsi, that's my answer to that question.
Great, Sumarie, thank you so much for those inputs. And I'm so glad that we have a lot of questions in the chat room, which we will actually address before I go on to further, you know, questions of the panelists. I think the first one was, and I'll ask Stephan. Stephan is also part of the panel, by the way. The question is, what is meant by inclusive growth in terms of the Startup Act? I think that's a very, very pertinent question, because if I am on this call, on this webinar, and I am in a township or peri-urban area, I'm curious to find out, what does inclusivity mean in this regard? So Stephan, I'm going to throw that to you around the question, what is meant by inclusive growth in terms of the Startup Act?
Thanks, Matsi. Yeah, I think the first part is that, when we're talking about our economy, and we look at what happened in recent times also in KwaZulu-Natal and KZN and Gauteng, the bottom line is that we need to get everyone involved in our economy. So when we talk about inclusive growth, it means that the benefits of this growth needs to be shared broadly. It can't just be shared with the people that are sitting at the top of the pile. For us, when we talk about inclusive growth and the development of the Startup Act, it talks about reaching out to entrepreneurs where they are, looking at the instruments that are benefiting them. And I think a lot of the current red tape and a lot of the current limitations that there are in terms of how services are accessed, how companies are registered, how companies have to barter for procurement opportunities, that is very much aggravated at the lower end of the spectrum in terms of inclusivity. So for us, at the heart of this act is really to simplify things and thereby making it easier for everyone to participate, not just in the opportunities, but also in the growth that comes out of that.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephan. I think inclusivity in the South African context is very, very important, because we don't want this to be something that speaks to one segment of the economy versus the other segment of the economy. It has to be inclusive. And that's why in our interventions, in our interactions, in our focus groups, in our working groups, we make sure that, we bring in everybody. And that's why we also ask that, put your hand up and say, I want to be part of this conversation. I want to be part of this, because it's not a girls only club or boys only club or Stellenbosch club or Pretoria club. It's actually, this is an ecosystem act. So it's important that we highlight the inclusivity of all of that. And then I'll also ask another question. So can we please discuss, so yes, I found this, and this is for you, Tanya. I'd be curious to see how the Startup Act enables the flow of capital to startups. We've seen how Section 12J has relatively failed us. So Tanya, if you could answer that question, which is curious to see how the Startup Act enables the flow of capital.
Sure, Matsi, and I see that there was another question that came through about, has there been analysis of the impact of 12J? So maybe I'll also answer that one. Sure. In terms of 12J and the tax incentive, I think if you look at the SAVCA VC survey, you can see that from 2016, when there were changes made to 12J to make it more accessible, there's been an exponential increase in the number of VC investments made and money that number of investments, as well as the actual amount that was invested. So 12J really did help spur more money and more growth of VC investors. However, we're under no disillusion that 12J didn't have the intended outcome that National Treasury wanted. And there is actually two studies that were done. One was done by the 12J Association, and the report that they've done is available on their website. And they focused on the jobs created by the 12J VCCs that they surveyed. Then the analysis was done also by National Treasury post the publication of that report, to also just look at what the impact was on 12J and the actual jobs that were created. So I think if we want to see, I don't say let's revive 12J, but let's learn from what was the best out of 12J. So if we say that only 34% of the venture capital companies invested in early stage startups and created jobs, what did they all have in common? What are some of the gray areas within the 12J incentive that was misinterpreted? How can we be more specific in the SA Startup Act? An example is clearly defining what a startup is, although I saw some comments about the length and duration of a startup. But let's be specific about what a startup is, who the money is intended for, so that we don't have any grayness or misinterpretation of the actual law or bill, and that the money flows to where it's supposed to flow. In terms of 12J and the lessons learned, I really think that we saw that there was definitely a benefit that came out of it, but that there was also abuse in terms of how it was invested. So the Startup Act, by defining what a startup is, really tries to ensure that the money flows, to the actual startups. So I think that, and also the fact that what we've also seen is that the results published by the 12J Association and by National Treasury did show that if money flows to where it's intended, it can definitely create jobs.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tanya, for those very comprehensive inputs. I think, when we heard beginning of this year that Section 12J will not necessarily be continued, it was a bit of an outcry in the ecosystem. And it was a function of, if it's not working, how can we fix it, versus how it should not necessarily be removed. And then also, Commissioner Jafta, I have noted your feedback. Would definitely have your details, and will definitely be in touch, because a lot of people ask the question, why is the government not on this particular panel? And the response to that, it's not a function of why not, it's when. And I think it's important as an ecosystem to gather ourselves, gather our thoughts, create a coalition, so that we're not just coming as individuals, because if we are an ecosystem that has challenges, it's important to speak with one voice. So we're gathering ourselves, and hence now the ability to put together a position paper, which is currently in its draft format, but we will be engaging the ecosystem and we will finalize it. And then once we finalize it, we'll be in a position to say to the government, this is what the collective ecosystem is saying, and this is how we would like to work with you. And it is a parallel process. And I'm glad that Commissioner Jafta, you've put your hand up, and would definitely like to engage with you, because the government has to be part of these conversations. We're not talking amongst ourselves. We have to engage with the government, because if we're saying we need a Startup Act, the government has to be in a very, very big way involved. I have noted all the other questions. I'm not ignoring them. I do have other questions for our panelists. And I think the next question goes to Melvyn. As it stands, do you have enough incentives to build your company in South Africa, contribute towards job creation and the economy? And what kind of incentives are you looking for you to feel that I'm happy here, my needs are being attended to, and I'd love to also give back and contribute towards jobs and also growing the economy? So Mel, if you could answer that questions around the incentives that you have currently in South Africa, or the ones that are actually missing. Give us some thoughts around that.
And so I'll take a philosophical bend and ultimately land on the answer to the question. I think ultimately entrepreneurs are people, businesses are ultimately made up of people. And so from that perspective, what's the incentive to be South Africa as a person? I mean, look, I love the continent. I mean, the Joburg sun is beating down on my face right now, stop my glow. And so I think just being in South Africa is a benefit. I think, we are very blessed to live in the country that we live in. I think there's already incentive for one to want to do things. I think the question is, what makes one want to do things elsewhere? Because you can build, especially in the current times, build a business in South Africa that services globally from South Africa. And so I've spoken to my friends, entrepreneurs who have gone from Cape Town to Silicon Valley and vice versa. And the rates, I think there's a pull factor here, but I think to your point around, building your business and scaling it in the South African context, I think there are certain challenges, and I think it's something small so we are a global company, and so we have over 300 employees around the world. And the reality is, I would like to have some of my international staff come work in South Africa, spend some time here. Some actually want to live here, and I think even just the admin and the process, and even the difficulty, sometimes the impossibility of making that happen is difficult, because you want it to be a cross-pollination, one team, one culture. But I think sometimes the flow of, call it, access to talent is a challenge, especially when some of the spaces you've been in, their skills may not exist locally, and that's the reality of the matter. And so I think that's something which is in front of mind for us as we think about growing. And so our thing's always been look, be global and grow, grow people internally, but definitely to punch above our weight globally. That free flow of people is a big one for us, particularly those that want to double down and set up base in South Africa.
Great. Melvyn, thank you so much for that. And Adrian, my next question is for you. Your practice goes beyond the South African borders, and give us examples of which countries are you are doing things right, and what can South Africa learn from that? Because you work across borders, so tell us what those who have gotten it right, what does that look like, and what does it mean, and how can we learn from that?
Thanks, Matsi. So we set up a consultancy in the UK just about 7 months before COVID to sort of explore this and to see if we could assist our clients in expanding offshore. And in that process, we engaged quite closely with the various UK initiatives, including the Global Entrepreneur Program and the UK South Africa Tech Hub. And what we saw there was a really simple system of motivating founders. So it's super simple to set up a company in the UK. You can do it genuinely in maybe 20 minutes, maybe half an hour. And it costs you, I think, £18. And if you set it up and if you qualify as an entrepreneur, you get quite a significantly preferential capital gains tax once you sell your company. I think it's 10%. And you can also then raise funds from anyone, any British person, on a basis they call EIS, an Entrepreneur Investment Scheme. And that the investors get remarkable tax benefits. I think if they lose everything, they still get significant tax credits, for example. And then they get capital gains tax-free returns in that cash if your company sells. And what's interesting about that is that you don't need a convoluted Section 12J company with regulated people and regulations. This right is given to anybody, any citizen who would like to invest in a startup company. And the themes I'm drawing on here is that they have seen quite radical simplification of the regulations to promote entrepreneurism. This is aside from just the general incentive and general energy and encouragement that the government gives to entrepreneurs. Another good example outside of the UK, I'm quite familiar with many people are, is the Dutch government. And they call it the orange carpet that they roll out if you want to start up a company in Holland, especially from outside of Holland. And they give you everything from school relocation services to local services. And it's quite amazing to see that encouragement. However, I think that we need to look through this and take those rules and apply them in South Africa. A poor startup that wants to set up and fund offshore, they've got to deal with 4 different radically complex frameworks of tax, for example. The first is the tax that covers the actual company's residence. The second is the tax relating to controlled foreign companies, which is it's basically a fiction created by the South African tax law to tax shareholders in South Africa of offshore revenue. We'll get into that later.
I've lost Adrian, so I'm not sure if that only one that lost Adrian. Sorry, Adrian, I didn't hear the last part of your comments. If you could just...
Sorry, it might have been my camera. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Wonderful. Yep. So I think I sort of indulged myself on tax treatment, but what we have is 4 really complex frameworks of tax, for example, that hit you if you try and set up an offshore funding company, an offshore holding company. And I think that what we really should be aligned on is that the ultimate goal is one simple thing. Your shares in your company become worth a radical amount, a remarkable amount. And that's where SARS, the tax authorities, that's where they should be looking at in order to get tax revenue. Classic capital gains tax on the value of your shares. Instead, there are all sorts of rules about not allowing you to leave the country. And if you do leave the country, then there's a temporary exit tax and that sort of thing. If we could just refine this to empower and simplify, as I said previously, the rules we've got at the moment are meant for large corporations, mining houses. I'm sure that we can build a simplified and streamlined system that can compete easily with other jurisdictions. Thanks, Matsi.
Great. Thank you very much, Adrian. So Tanya, I have a question for you, and then I'll also reflect on Andrea Young's question. So What would it mean for South Africa if we were to remove exchange control limitations? Because, South Africa is one of the only, not only, but, not a lot of countries still have exchange control. So what would it mean if we had to lift exchange control limitations? And then once you've answered that, I'll reflect on Andrea Young's question.
Well, Matsi, if we relax exchange control restrictions, it will definitely mean that entrepreneurs will be able to raise foreign capital and raise it so much quicker. Currently, and Adrian can speak to this because I think a lot of what he does and his practice is built off of the work that he does regarding exchange control, IP, loop structures, is that it's costly, it's complex, it's a lengthy process. It puts off international investors from investing there because there's uncertainty. And they can do similar investments elsewhere much quicker, much faster. And investors are looking for policy certainty when they invest. So when we do relax exchange control restrictions for startups and scale-ups, I think we'll see a lot more capital coming through to our entrepreneurs because, as I said earlier, there's not enough VC fund managers to make multiple rounds of investment. So entrepreneurs are then forced to go outside of our borders to raise capital. And a lot of times they then have to list their IP offshore, etc. And what these international investors bring is not only capital. It's also new networks, access to markets, a lot of the things that Melvyn spoke about earlier on that entrepreneurs need. So I think it's really looking at what are the barriers to preventing these startups and scale-ups from growing, and definitely exchange control is one of them.
Great, thank you. So unfortunately, I've had to switch off my camera because my network is terrible. And I will not blame it on Eskom because we don't have load shedding. But Andrea Young's question is, what financial legislation amendments is being proposed by the Startup Act? If you could reflect on that, is it anything different from what you have been lobbying for, Tanya?
No, it's not really anything different. As Stephan said, it's about using what we have and just improving on it and making it better. So it's incentives to encourage investment. So as I said, not a reinvention of 12J, but incentives to ensure that there's more investment flowing to fund managers and to entrepreneurs to invest. And then address the exchange control limitations. There are a few other aspects that are covered in the SA Startup Act which aren't necessarily linked to financial instruments. But I think once we see more money flowing to those that can make the investments, we can also think about more interesting investment kind of vehicles, such as blended finance, such as first loss and match funding, to really channel not only private capital, but also public capital into these startups and scale-ups. So there's lots of opportunities here that I think we should look at.
Okay. No, Tanya, thank you so much for that. And the next question that I have is from Giyani. I just need to find it, and I'm not ignoring you. I just need to find the question. It's a very, very interesting question. And I think, Stephan, I'd like for you to take a stab at it. It's around BBBEE and the role that it plays within the Startup Act. So highly contentious. I remember when I saw the first draft of the position paper and I said to Stephan, I'm not really sure about this, but Stephan, what are your thoughts around BBBEE and the role that it plays within the Startup Act? And then I'll kind of also ask a couple of other panel members.
Thanks, Matsi, and thank you for the kind question at this late stage. No, yeah, absolutely. I think the important thing here is that, I mean, this act is not there to supersede any other legislation in South Africa. And the legislation in South Africa and the policies of South Africa are there for specific purposes. And this act needs to respect that and abide by that. What we're saying, though, in the Startup Act is that a lot of our startups are hampered in their growth opportunities because they are excluded from procurement opportunities because they are not level 1 BBBEE. That's one part of it. The other part of it is that even companies that are at one stage 111 BEE that take on international investment, sometimes misses out post-investment on their BE status because their ownership status has changed. And that doesn't make sense. So what we are asking for here in the Startup Acquisition paper is to amend the procurement side of triple BE, not in terms of triple BE policy as a whole, but in order to give a special status to qualifying startups so that they can be able to compete as a level 1 triple BE supplier from a procurement point of view. That will not abscond them from the responsibilities that they have as employers in terms of what they have to do, in terms of skills development, in terms of employment diversity, and in terms of playing their role in terms of ensuring that we have an inclusive society. By all means, that is not the case, but we want to advocate for an easing of procurement so that they can compete against those companies that have got the money to throw money at instruments and to buy their BE status, which is not within the ability of a 2 or a 3-man startup enterprise.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I think, you know, a lot of people have sentiments around triple BEE. It's something that is necessary. Some people see it not as necessary. And remember, this is just a draft document. So we will be going through a process of engaging the ecosystem and gathering their thoughts around what we should be doing or what we should be proposing. Should we cancel it altogether? Probably not. But should we find a way of how does it enable us as high impact, high growth entrepreneurs to be able to be competitive, but also to be able to contribute towards the transformation of our country? That is something that should never be neglected. But then how do we ensure that it doesn't negate from our ability to create jobs? You know, all these topics that we're talking about today are not necessarily the easiest topics. So that's why we didn't sign up for this because it's easy. We signed up for this because something needs to happen, something needs to change. And Stephan also did mention that the you know, this particular proposed Startup Act does go parallel to the national development, you know, the NDP of the country. So it's important for that. And so my last question to the panelists, and before we leave, we definitely will be asking more of the questions. I saw a question that talks about SARS and their inability or not, you know, they not being flexible enough to engage. You know, I mean, countries like India have tax breaks for startups. I think between 3 to 5 years, they have tax breaks in specific industries. So how are we going to create incentives that will allow us to grow before we even tax? Because right now, the minute you register a company, you have to be tax compliant. So there's a lot of things that we can do. There are great global examples of what can be done. And in essence, the Startup Act is how do we look at those kind of interventions that would just make it very easy and make South Africa very attractive, because at the end of the day, we want to be able to see enterprises that are growing, enterprises that are competitive, enterprises that are innovative, and yeah, so how do we make that you know, a very inclusive environment? So my last question to my panelists, and then I'll open other questions from the audience, is, in your opinion, and in relation to the position paper that's been presented, what are the top 3 areas that need to be focused on moving forward in terms of the Startup Act? So if you could just name your top 3 to 5, or actually just keep it to 3 areas of improvement, because we also have to recognize we can't fix everything. We can't tackle everything. So we have to start with something, build up on that, work on it. And then as we go along, now that we have something that's established that speaks to startups, we have to build up on that. So I will start with you, Mel, in terms of what are the top areas that need to be focused on so that we can move forward.
Yeah, and I think the top areas that I have are really a function of where we are today. And just to preface the point in that, I think there's a rising tide in terms of interest in startup high growth businesses around the world. And I think from that perspective, the question is, what can we do to better position ourselves as a country, as entrepreneurs, as people in the ecosystem to benefit from that? And I would argue that it comes down to access. I think both access to finance and access to human capital. And so on the finance, I think it's the one which I think many of the panelists spoke about around, you know, how do you make it more attractive for investors to invest in South Africa, and some of the tax and legal implications of doing so. I think lowering the barriers there will therefore lower the hurdle for people to actually get going, which I think is very important right now, because I think with the big valuations and exits we're seeing now, that will be important. I think ultimately attracting capital, because I think even through COVID, this work remotely, work from home context has meant that people actually do want to, more often than not from abroad, work in South Africa. And so from that perspective, I think being able to unlock those two being my top two priorities. And then the third one would be one around procurement, which I think is a deeper one, which I think touches on the BEE point. But I think how do you unlock value for startups locally in terms of the actual sales cycles? I think those three would be very important.
Great. Adrian, what are your thoughts around that? The top areas in which we just need to focus on in relation to the Startup Act.
Thanks, Matsi. So the three suggestions I'm going to make are again centered on the principal goals of empowering global funding from global sources, access to global markets, and creating appeal to international acquirers for the startups that are South African. And for that, I've got the following suggestions. One, empower offshore holding companies without creating an exit tax penalty. So here the theme is defer tax until an exit. That's ultimately the goal. Two, also allow or empower the movement of IP offshore on the same deferred tax basis. So we don't lose any value in the country, but we again defer that tax until exit. And the third is a pre-approved simple transfer pricing framework, because transfer pricing is the most complex and expensive and painful part of internationalization. And I would like to sneak in a fourth if I can. This is the South African employee wealth creation point. So the employees who put all their sweat into the equity of these startups, I should really strongly think that their equity incentives should be rewarded and taxed as capital gains, not income tax, which is double what capital gains tax is. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Adrian. Your network is not the greatest, nor is mine. It comes with the territory of having to operate from home. Tanya, if you could answer the same question around what are the top three areas in relation to the Startup Act that we should actually move with?
Sure. For me, it's the relaxation window, and we've spoken a lot about that. We've actually spoken about all three of them. The second is the incentives to encourage investment, so attracting more capital. Out of interest, 74 investors participated in the SAVCA VC survey this year. If you compare that to the state of California, which also has about 40 million people, just in the state of California, there are 800 VC investors. So just want to leave you with that thought, because it reminds me of Porter's cluster theory, where it's this concentration of businesses, suppliers, companies within a geographical area that leads to, that are interconnected, but it leads to increased productivity and it leads to increased success. So maybe just thinking about what do we need more of? So successful entrepreneurs and more fund managers. And then lastly, the exchange control limitations. We saw it in the position paper, we saw it in the Partech research. South Africa attracted over $200 million worth of VC funding. Nigeria attracted over $700 million. So we really need to be more competitive as a country and give our entrepreneurs a fighting chance.
Great, thank you so much, Tanya. And then Sumarie, your thoughts around the top three areas in relation to having a Startup Act that's really going to have impact.
Thanks, Matsi. I mean, essentially, Tanya, Melvyn, and Stephan really have mentioned the core. So I think I'm just going to speak at it at a bit of a high level. So for me, if you said to me, what are my top three overall in terms of, you know, taking this initiative forward, I would literally have said to you, implementation, implementation, implementation. I think that, you know, the next big challenge is really going to be to make sure that we can get this implemented. So I think that's really where a core focus needs to be. I would, though, at the same time say, if you said to me, well, look, mention something else other than implementation, I would say championship. And what I mean by that is that we need championship of this initiative also at a national government level. I have seen in the comments that there have been some, that there has been some feedback to say, look, there is, you know, a similar initiative within the national government movement. So it'll be interesting to see what that is. And then I would say what is also essential is business and civil society support. I think it's clear that, you know, we have business support for this initiative, but I also think that the more civil society supporters we have, you know, the better, because ultimately more voices will be able to shout louder, if that makes sense. So yeah, that's my answer to that one, Matsi. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sumarie, for those inputs. I think it is important that implementation at the end of the day. I'm just going to now reflect on some of the questions in the chat room. Christopher Luke Piers, his question is, why is government and SARS so reluctant in creating a conducive transaction and tax environment for startups and for investors? I think, Tanya, you know, SAVCA does a lot of advocacy with the government. What are your thoughts around that? Why do you think they're reluctant? Adrian, as well, you know, dealing with this on behalf of your clients, if you could just share some of your sentiments around the reluctance to make things easier. Could you kindly share that with us?
Yeah, so I think Adrian will be best placed to answer this, but Matsi, from our experience, you know, the government has a role to protect the fiscus and ensure that there's money flowing to the fiscus. So the decisions that government makes is with the great intentions of making sure, you know, from a fiscus perspective, that the country is protected. But I think it's just a matter of looking at different ways of doing things and just considering what works in other jurisdictions and see how it can be applied to South Africa without compromising our fiscus or our tax base.
Great, thanks so much for those inputs. Adrian, your thoughts?
Can you guys hear me okay? How's my network doing?
It's fine, so far I can hear you.
Yeah, so yes, there is this protective jealousy about our tax base, and there should be, because it's ultimately the value that gets created in South Africa and should be taxed here. The problem is we have this legacy of overly conservative exchange controls, and as I said, they sort of more paired to the very big businesses and trying to keep those businesses in South Africa and paying tax here. And in a global world, that's just not appropriate. If it doesn't change, then it'll be broken. So yeah, I agree that finding the simplest models, I love the position papers idea of having pre-approved simple models for startups to link into for their offshore operations. I strongly believe that'll be a success.
Great. Thank you so much, Adrian, for those inputs. I must also reflect on some of the comments. I'm going to just read out your comment is, I love the initiative, but think by touching on such a politically sensitive measure as BBBEE would render it a stillborn. By setting the turnover cap at 100 million rands to qualify as a startup, it will be seen as effectively circumventing the current BEE codes. I do agree with you. I think also as we were preparing for this particular webinar, we did know that, you know, touching on the BBBEE component is a very sensitive issue, because it talks to how do we transform an untransformed economy as we progress and as we reflect on high growth, high impact enterprises. We need to take everybody as we go along. So I do believe that this is just a foundation, right? The policy, the position paper is a framework. And over the next coming months, we will be now interrogating all the components and then also refining to what are the key components that we should be focusing on. But BBBEE, for me personally, as you know, Black female South African who's trying to build a local and international business, it's very important for us to consider that. It is a very politically sensitive issue, and over the next coming months, we'll definitely be able to get inputs. And then there's also a comment from Mohammed, and what is also extremely difficult for startups is the relevant laws that need to be followed. From my point of view, there should be enough assistance from the government to allow for the ease of navigation through the different acts. You are correct. There is a lot of things to consider. You know, the premise of our findings was around the Small Business Act, National Small Business Act, which currently is being reviewed. And in essence, one of the things we're considering, either starting a whole new act, or how do we add the Startup Act as part of, as they're redefining the Small Business Act. Certainly, there has to be, it has to come together, because as a high impact, high growth entrepreneur, you have to consider a lot of things. But how does it come together? So in what we're doing is, how do we try unify our universe that governs us? And in essence, how does it, in essence, then help us as an ecosystem? So I'm very, very grateful for all the inputs that are coming through. This is the beginning of a very long process. It's not going to just take a few months. It's not going to take a year. It's going to probably take 3 years, given other countries' experiences. And in essence, this is a foundation, a foundational document. It is still in draft format. And we really do encourage you to really be part of this movement. We've created a framework, we've created a foundation, and in essence, we want you to be part of the conversations, part of the working groups, part of the focus groups. And we're also creating a platform that we want you, because you all exist within part of the ecosystem, you have your own communities, but we want you to engage your various communities and come up with solutions. And then at the end, we aggregate these solutions, and then we finalize this position paper, and we then would be in a position to engage the government. And for that, we encourage you to go to the website, which is startupact.org.za. You'll be able to download the Startup Act position paper, the one that's still in a draft format. And also we encourage you to give us inputs. So I think as we wrap up, because we have about 7 minutes to go, what are the closing commentary from our panelists? I think, Melvyn, I'll start with you. You are an entrepreneur. You are the reason why we're here today. You are the reason why we're trying to create a conducive environment for you to thrive, for you to stay in South Africa, for you to build from South Africa. So what are your closing remarks?
I think, to quote someone probably before my time, we're all in this together. I think the reality is that a rising tide raises all the ships, and I think even the benefits of entrepreneurs benefits the country from a tax base, from a pride, from an IP, from everything else. And so I think regardless of where you sit within the ecosystem, I definitely encourage everyone to contribute to the conversation and apply their minds critically. Because ultimately, I think to your point, Matsi, it is a draft document, and the ecosystem needs to speak up in relation to that.
Great, thank you so much, Mel. Adrian, your parting shots?
Yeah, thanks. I'd echo Melvyn's points, actually. I think that the community will be the most powerful driving force of this. I think that we have radical potential as a country, as a source of remarkable entrepreneurism that can affect the world. And I think that if we can build something that can really empower, and empowerment in my mind means simplification as well, I think then we'll have achieved quite something. Thank you.
I'm really struggling to hear Adrian.
I'm sorry, Matsi. I think my Wi-Fi has gone down.
Yeah, I think, Adrian, between you and I, our networks are terrible. Hopefully everybody can hear me now. But Tanya, if you could, just reflect on your parting shots as we go forward and chart ahead.
Thanks, Matsi. I think this is a great starting point for a Startup Act, so pun intended. But it really is about people being open-minded, being collaborative, and even the conversation in the chat group today shows that there's further discussions that need to be held, further things that may need to be taken into consideration, and priorities that we need to look at. So welcome this level of interaction and excitement for what could potentially be, a competitive advantage for South Africa in the long term.
Tanya, my network is terrible, but I'm hoping that you had finished your parting shots and I'm not cutting you short. And Sumarie, if you could just give us your final commentary.
Sure, thank you, Matsi. I think really for me, the the essence of my final piece of feedback is just that this initiative isn't, in my opinion, a nice to have. This isn't even a question anymore, should we or shouldn't we? I think it is absolutely essential in terms of South Africa's road forward, in terms of competitiveness, in terms of innovation. And I think today is evidence that, you know, there are people out there in the community who feel equally passionate about this initiative, and it's so great to have been online with so many of you. And I just encourage all of us to go out there and to be the voices, you know, that talk about what the benefit is of this potential act for not only the country, but for the continent. And, you know, at the end of the day, if promulgating this act will benefit everybody in South Africa in the long term, in any event, it's a win for all of us. So that's just my closing thought. Thanks, Matsi.
Okay, Tanya, I'm sorry, Sumarie, I can't hear you per se, but I think Stephan also as a researcher in chief, what are your parting shots?
Yeah, thanks, Matsi, and thanks everyone. I think, you know, for me, at the heart of the Startup Act lies the reality that there's already thousands of startups in South Africa that are contributing every day to the upliftment of societies, to wealth creation for families. It's happening already. And I think at the heart of this Startup Act says, how can we continuously just apply our minds towards improving the dispensation by removing obstacles? If that is the one thing that we keep doing as government, as private sector, as corporate entities, as investors, and keep asking ourselves, how can we make it easier so that the benefits that these startups develop and generate on a daily basis can become more and more and more in our country? It's not a question of putting something in place for something in the future. It's happening already. How do we maximize that? And just by removing obstacles and making it easier to proliferate. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Stephan. I think it's very important to reflect on this conversation. It's the beginning of something big. Some of the sentiments are, it looks like it's a turning point because we are really coming together as an ecosystem. We're coming as one voice. We're articulating our needs, defining what startups are and the contribution that they can have to our economy. And in essence, I just also have to emphasize on the fact that, you know, the road to getting a Startup Act is not a short one. It's a long one, which we must travel together. And the next 6 months is about unpacking, getting inputs. It's about coalition building. So more and more organizations must feel like they are part of this movement. And the next couple of months, we'll also have a round of focus groups. Please put your hand up and tell us if you want to engage your various communities because we want your inputs. And then also very important for you to sign up on the startupact.org.za website. Really, that's kind of where we're going to be engaging and communicating and just be part of this movement, be part of the change that we want to see in South Africa. And as I close, I really want to thank, you know, the ecosystem at large, everybody that's been on this call for your contribution, for your need to ensure that, you know, in 2030, we will see a difference because we have spoken as an ecosystem. We have articulated our needs. The steering committee, the organizations behind this endeavor, SAVCA, Digital Collective Africa, Silicon Cape, for Policy, Loud Hailer has done such phenomenal work in really promoting the work we're doing, Westgrow, SiMODiSA, and also the World Bank for funding the research, the preliminary research. And there are a couple of future partners that we'll be introducing. I won't mention them now, but we are in the process of getting more people that are rallying behind this. And to all of you, let's just, if this is one chance we can have as a country to really build our country, contribute towards our economy, raise the profile of South African startups, now is the time because we have to have a Startup Act. So my network is failing me, but I'm thankful to everybody that joined us today, and more will be said. And thanking you all, and we will definitely be in touch and wishing you all well. And yeah, so all the best. Thank you very much.